Chelsea here from So Simple Home. Today we are talking about sewing tools. This is actually a big and important part of sewing lessons. Sewing tools, a proper tool, can really make or break your project. Have I used incorrect tools before? Yes. Is it a good idea? No. So let me introduce you to some of these tools. Some of them you may know, some of them you may not. Some of them you may have, some of them you might want to get, depending on the type of sewing that you're doing and the ease in which you want to do sewing. So let's go through some of these tools. First off, let's start with the big one. In order to sew, you need a sewing machine, or at least a thread and needle, but ultimately you'll want a sewing machine. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. In fact, most sewing machines can get the job done. The new higher tech sewing machines are really nice if you want lots of different types of stitches, especially decorative stitches. But really, a super basic, inexpensive sewing machine can do wonders, especially as a beginner sewer. And then as you get better, as you decide you really enjoy sewing, you can change up your machine, get a more expensive machine, or like me, look into older model machines that have metal parts and gears, which there's pros and cons to that, but we won't get into that here. So you'll need a sewing machine to start with. Then some of the other tools that you're going to want. Of course, you're going to want thread, and there's lots of different types of thread. There's thread on lots of different types of spools. This is a much larger spool. Spools like this are often used for sergers or overlock machines, which are sergers, or a cover stitch machine, excuse me. But you can use spools like this. You just need to make sure that you can thread things correctly on your machine. There's also just your regular thread spool, or you can get a lot of these thinner that kind of look more like embroidery thread spools. Either one will work with your machine. It kind of just depends on what brand you're interested in and sometimes what type of sewing you're going to do. Because if you have an embroidery machine, you need some embroidery thread. So thread can change, but you need to make sure you're looking for more of an all-purpose thread is probably what you're going to start with. Coats and Clarks has all-purpose thread. You can get Gutermann thread. Most hobby stores, Joann's, Hobby Lobby, Michael's, Walmart even have spools of thread that you can purchase, and most of them will work, especially for beginner projects. As you start to sew, you'll start to decide on what kind of thread that you like and what brand you like. So just kind of experiment, see what you like. There's definitely a cost difference in them, but quality over quantity sometimes is worth it. So okay, a couple of other things that you need to have in order to start sewing. Okay, first, a tape measure. You need a really good tape measure, one that can move well, one that is long enough. Make sure you get one that's at least 60 inches wide. I have some tape measures that are really stiff and I hate them. You want one that can go around the body so you can do body measurements, and one you can use for all sorts of projects. So tape measure, you're gonna want that. Another thing you need in your stash is a pincushion. Now, granted, this isn't a cushion, it's not smushy. This is a magnetic pincushion. Sorry, I was gonna say metallic, that's not right. A magnetic pincushion, so my pins just naturally cling to it. I love this because if I drop my pins, then I can just put it on the floor and pick them up. Makes it really easy. But you can have a cushy pincushion as well. As for pins, I just like traditional pin. I like a quilter's pin. I like them long. But you can use wonder clips. That's a big one in the industry right now, using clips instead of pins. You can get a flathead pin, so instead of this round pin or round top, it's flat. Some people really like those. It's a little bit easier to handle. Just make sure you have good quality pins. And I would say get magnetic pins. You want them to actually be metal pins and not plastic pins. Plastic pins tend to bend a lot easier. The needle will break on them, and I don't enjoy them, but that's totally up to you. Another thing you need is a good seam ripper. This is just one of the inexpensive seam rippers. I don't even think I can take it apart. It's used so much. That comes with most sewing kits. You'll just get an inexpensive one. that's fine. You can get a super fancy one, that's fine too. Just make sure you have a seam ripper. They all work pretty much the same. There is a nice ergonomic one that I'll pin down in the description for you, and that's a good one. You'll also need a seam gauge. This is a seam gauge. Usually it comes with any type of sewing kit, beginner sewing kit. You can change this little knob to go forwards, backwards, whatever, and it helps you with how wide a seam you need. So most projects are like 3/8 of an inch or 5/8 of an inch. So I just move this over to 5/8 of an inch, and then I can put it up against my fabric and measure my fabric that way so that I get my seam correct. It's just really handy to have, especially if you're ironing. So a nice little seam gauge. Some other things that you're gonna want are a good pair of sewing scissors. These are my gingers. The gingers are expensive, but totally worth it. They stay nice and sharp. They're heavy duty. They cut through all material. Serious, I've cut through canvas, denim. I mean, especially really heavyweight fabrics. I love my gingers. But I also have Fiskars. I really like Fiskars. They work for most projects. They're also really good if you tend to lose your scissors and you have to replace them, or if your family uses them on a paper project and then they're not sharp anymore. You can always get some Fiskars. I also recommend that you have a pair of pinking shears. Those are the scissors that have the teeth on them. You can see the teeth here. That's really important, especially as a beginner when you're doing seam allowances. Pinking your seam allowances make life so much easier, I promise. So we'll go over that in a seam allowance video. And then I would recommend a little pair of embroidery scissors. This tiny little pair here. I have another pair here as well. It's just nice to have a small set of scissors that can get into little seams, little threads. My machine personally doesn't have a thread cutter. A lot of machines do have a thread cutter. So I use my embroidery shears all the time. In fact, I leave them on my Pincushion most of the time. You'll also want to get some extra bobbins. Most machines will come with a couple of bobbins. We talked about this in our first lesson on the parts of the sewing machine. Make sure you research what bobbins work for your machine and get the correct ones. A lot of people like to get the already wound bobbins. You can buy them like on Amazon in bulk. I've never done that. It is a possibility. Just make sure you get the right type of bobbin. A couple of other things that you can get that you don't necessarily need but do make things a little handier. A rotary cutter. It has a blade on it that's round, and you can cut your fabric really fast instead of having to use scissors. So rotary cutters are really nice. If you get a rotary cutter, you're going to want to get yourself a self-healing mat. That's what this green mat is, and you've probably seen them. Most of the time they're green, but you can get them in lots of colors anymore. They have measurements on them. In fact, let me show you this cute one. I love to use this one. This is a cute little tiny self-healing mat put out by Riley Blake. But it has the measurements on it. You line up your fabric and your ruler, and you can just cut with your rotary cutter to whatever size that you need. So a self-healing mat is a really nice tool to have along with a rotary cutter. I'd also suggest getting a clear ruler. Now, you don't have to get one this big. You could just get like a regular 12-inch ruler that's clear. I have clear rulers in all sorts of sizes. But this really helps, especially if you're using a self-healing mat. But because it's clear, you can see your fabric as you're working with it to make sure things are lining up, especially if you're going to get into quilting or cutting for purses or things like that where you have a lot of rectangles and squares. Now, if you're going to get into sewing clothing, I would suggest getting a French curve. So this is a French curve ruler. It's kind of fat on the end. It gets kind of skinny over here. This helps when you're doing armholes or armscye and legs and crotch and all of those different types of measurements to help to smooth the curves and the lines on patterns. So that's another tool that's great to have, but not necessary at this point if you're just starting to sew. But all of these tools are wonderful. Couple others, a fabric pin, a washable fabric pin is always nice to have. You can also do chalk. I really like chalk. Just make sure it doesn't have a lot of wax in it. You don't want a real waxy chalk. I like chalk wheels. Those are really nice too. Another thing is fray check. I love fray check. Fray check is a liquid, and the bottle comes in two ways. You have this way, or you can take this off and use just the little kind of dropper almost. Fray check you put on the ends or the raw edge of a material or fabric, and it stops it from fraying. So as you know, fabric will fray. So if you clip into something and you put a little hole in it, you can fray check it, and that'll help it from not fraying. So this stuff works wonders, especially when you're first starting to sew and you make a lot of mistakes and you're like, how do I fix that? You might hand sew it or stitch it, but fray check will really help to keep ends from fraying. And this also works good if you're using a material that frays a lot, like a denim that'll fray a lot, or like a chiffon, or something that you're working with that will fray a lot as you're sewing or as you handle it. So you can use that, and it makes the process a little less frustrating. All right, I lied. One more. Sewing machine needles. You're gonna need needles. You're gonna probably want a lot of them. There's lots of different needles out there. I personally like to stick with just the universal needle for most of my projects. You can get it in different sizes. I have a blog post all about the different sizes of needles, so I'll leave that in down below. But there's different sizes. The smaller the needle, the thinner the needle is typically. The larger the needle, the higher the number. Big numbers are for heavier materials. So if you want to sew denim, you're going to need a heavier needle. If you want to sew silks and satins, you're going to need a smaller needle. So hopefully that helps. You can also get jersey needles. So if you plan to sew with knits, which is something that I love to do, you can get jersey needles, and those work really well for sewing on knit materials. Those are the stretchy fabrics. And then you can get a twin needle. Let me pull this guy out. A twin needle is a double needle, and this is typically used for knits as well, or hemming. So I love using my twin needle. I do not own a serger or a cover stitch machine. I do all of my sewing on my regular sewing machine, and so I use things like this double needle to help me. All right, I think that is all the materials or tools that you might need to get sewing, other than fabric, which we'll talk about in a different lesson. But I hope this helped you. I hope it inspired you to add to your collection, or make sure that you know what tools and materials that you might need. If you have other tools or materials you think a beginner sewer needs, please add them in the comments below. Or if you have questions or concerns, make sure and comment as well. And we will see you next time.